The day Vanessa Whitmore stood in the middle of my runway and announced that the Homeowners Association had taken control of what she called common community property, I did not argue with her. I just looked past her shoulder at the new houses rising against my eastern fence line and asked one question: who signed off on those? She laughed and told me a man like me should know when to step aside for a civilized neighborhood. 3 weeks later, a federal vehicle stopped in front of my hangar. An inspector unfolded a map, pointed at those same roof lines, and asked who authorized construction there. Vanessa stopped laughing. If you enjoy tense stories where an arrogant association gets cornered by its own paperwork, follow along and watch me back Vanessa Whitmore into a corner she built herself. My name is Marcus Hale, and for 47 years, the flattest, quietest piece of ground I have ever known has belonged to my family. It sits on 43 acres of open Carolina clay and fescue, and running down the middle of it is a strip of asphalt 2,900 feet long that my father poured with borrowed equipment and a stubbornness I inherited whole. He called it Hale Field, and he painted the name on the side of the barn before he ever painted it on a sign. As a boy, I stood at the edge of that strip and watched him lift off in a crop duster that smelled like hot oil and cut grass, and I learned the sound of a healthy engine before I learned long division. When he died and the land came to me, I did not turn it into anything clever. I resurfaced the pavement, rebuilt the drainage so the west end stopped ponding after storms, replaced the windsock and its pole, and put a new roof on the hangar. That last part matters more than anything else I am going to tell you. When the developers who built Crescent Ridge bought the surrounding parcels a little more than a decade ago, Hale Field was already there, already paved, already drawn on the plats, already noted in the aviation records that any competent surveyor would have pulled before writing a single check. It appeared on the boundary maps. It appeared in the environmental review. It appeared in plain letters on the original approval documents that let those first 400 homes go vertical. Nobody was tricked, nobody was surprised, and nobody wandered innocently into the flight path of a mystery. They built next to a working airstrip because the land was cheap and the view was open, and they knew precisely why the view was open. I also owned something the developers never quite understood the value of. A narrow ribbon of land, 60 feet wide and just under a quarter-mile long, ran from the south end of my property out to the county road, and that ribbon was mine by deed, not by easement, not by courtesy, not by some handshake my grandfather made with a neighbor. Every truck that reached my hangar reached it across ground with my name on the title. I paid the taxes on that strip every year, filed with the same account number, and kept the receipts in a green accordion folder in the office off the hangar. It seemed like a small thing then. It became the hinge on which everything turned. Vanessa Whitmore became president of the Crescent Ridge Association about 2 years before any of this started. She was 44, expensively dressed in a way that looked effortless and was not, and she drove a white German sedan she parked at angles that took 2 spaces. Her whole tenure was built on one promise, which was expansion eastward, because the eastern parcels were the last valuable dirt left inside the association's ambitions, and because bigger meant more dues, more prestige, and more reasons to keep her in the chair. She was good at meetings. She was good at making people feel that agreeing with her was the same as being reasonable. What she was not good at, I would learn, was answering direct questions. The first time she came down my drive, she stepped out of that white sedan and looked at my truck, which is 19 years old and has a dent in the tailgate from a deer, and then she looked at my coveralls, which had a fresh smear of oil across the chest because I had been elbow deep in a magneto since dawn. She smiled the way people smile at a stray dog they have decided not to feed. Then she asked me, in a voice pitched to carry to the 2 board members waiting in her car, whether I really still used this thing as an airport. I wiped my hands on a rag and told her it was not a thing. It was Hale Field, and it had been Hale Field since 1986. When she came back, the offer was gone and the language had changed. Now, a private runway beside million-dollar homes was inconsistent with the future of the community. Now there were concerns, always plural and never attributed, about noise and safety and property values. Now I was hearing the word outdated attached to something I had personally resurfaced 2 summers earlier. I have been a black man in aviation for a long time, and I know the exact temperature at which a conversation stops being about the asset and starts being about the person holding it. That conversation had cooled to that temperature and kept going. I understood then that she was finished negotiating with me. She was not trying to buy Hale Field anymore. She wanted it to disappear, and she had decided the cleanest way to make something disappear is not to move it, but to make the paperwork forget it ever existed. I did not know yet how far she had already gone. I only knew that a woman who talks about your property in the past tense has already been imagining a future where you are not in it. Then came the Tuesday morning. I drove out to pick up parts and found a sign standing at my own gate. It was professionally made, aluminum, mounted on 2 new galvanized posts set in fresh concrete, and it read Crescent Ridge Homeowners Association, Community Property, Authorized Access Only. The posts were sunk into ground that appeared on my deed, on my tax bill, and on every survey since the Ford administration. I sat in my truck with the engine running for a full minute and looked at it, and I understood that we had left the part of this where people are polite. I did not tear the sign down, and I want to be clear about why. A man who rips out a post at 7 in the morning is a man on somebody's video being described as violent and unstable by lunchtime. Instead, I photographed it from 4 angles, with the gate and the property pin in frame, and I emailed the association office asking them to remove it within 7 days and explaining, plainly, that it sat on private land. I attached a copy of my recorded deed and the parcel identification number. I kept my language flat and courteous, because flat and courteous reads very well later when strangers in a conference room are deciding which of 2 people sounds reliable. Then I went and got my parts. Vanessa did not apologize and did not remove anything. 4 days later, she came down my drive again, this time with 2 board members and a leather portfolio she carried like a badge. She stood on my gravel and told me that in the course of a boundary review, the association had determined that the runway parcel fell inside an area designated as Common Recreational Reserve under a recent planning amendment. According to her, my continued use of it was a courtesy the board had generously extended and could withdraw. She said all this in the tone of a woman explaining a menu to someone who cannot read. I let her finish. Then I asked her a single question, and it was not the emotional one she was braced for. I asked her to give me the recording book and page where that ownership was memorialized, or failing that, the document number of the instrument that transferred title from me to the association. A planning designation and a deed are 2 different animals, and anyone who has worked around land for 20 minutes knows it. Vanessa's mouth moved slightly, and one of the board members looked at his shoes. She said the association's attorney would be in touch and that I should not make this harder than it needed to be. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a misunderstanding. The attorney letter arrived 2 days later, and it was ambitious. It demanded that I cease all flight operations immediately, remove the Hale Field signage, keep aircraft out of the area entirely, surrender gate keys to the association office, and permit surveyors to access the runway for conversion planning into what the letter called a green corridor with walking paths. There was no citation to a deed anywhere in 5 pages. There were, however, 7 separate references to community standards and 1 paragraph about the disruptive character of low-flying aircraft over residential rooftops, which I found interesting since my pattern had been flown the same way since before those rooftops existed. I read it twice and made 3 copies. What actually stopped me was the final page. Buried under the signature block, almost as an afterthought, was a note that the association anticipated deploying additional residential infrastructure along the eastern boundary and expected my cooperation in avoiding delays. Additional residential infrastructure. I put the letter down on the workbench and walked out the hangar door and down the length of my own runway, all 2,900 feet of it, until I reached the eastern tree line where the property tapers toward the creek. I had not walked out there in maybe 5 weeks. Through the pines I saw survey stakes with orange ribbon, and not 2 or 3 of them. There were dozens. They ran in a grid that started barely 300 feet off my center line and marched east into the field, and behind them, parked on a pad of fresh crushed stone, sat an excavator and 2 dump trucks. Somebody had already cut a construction entrance off the far road. Somebody had already cleared brush along a line that would put front doors directly under the approach end of a runway I had landed on that very morning. Vanessa was not trying to take my strip so she could plant walking paths and native grasses. She was trying to take it because she had already started building houses beside it, and an active airstrip on the other side of that fence was a problem she needed to erase before anybody with authority looked closely. The county planning office picked up on the 3rd ring. I gave the clerk my name and then the parcel identification number, and I heard keys clicking on the other end. Then the clicking stopped, and there was a silence that lasted long enough that I asked if she was still there. She said she was, and then she said, carefully, that she needed to check something with a supervisor, because their system had Hale Field flagged as discontinued. Not private, not restricted. Discontinued. I looked out the office window at my airplane, still ticking as it cooled, with the tie-down ropes hanging loose, because I had not gotten around to securing it yet. I told her that was going to be difficult, because I had landed there myself about 4 hours ago. She did not laugh. She asked me to hold, and the hold lasted 11 minutes, and when she came back her voice had changed entirely. That afternoon I hired Grant Holloway, a real estate attorney out of the county seat who came recommended by a man I trusted more than I trusted lawyers in general. Grant was in his 60s, spoke maybe 40 words in our first hour together, and made me repeat the timeline 3 times while he wrote in a legal pad with a mechanical pencil. He did not tell me I had a great case. He told me that great cases are built out of boring documents and that we were going to go get all of them. Within a week, he had filed records requests for the entire planning file on the Eastern Expansion, which the association and its development partner were marketing as Crescent Ridge East. What came back filled 2 bankers' boxes. We spread it across his conference table and worked through it in order, and a shape emerged that I did not like at all. About 2 years earlier, a new planning submission had been filed for the eastern parcels, and inside the site analysis narrative, on page 31, in a paragraph about surrounding land uses, was a phrase that stopped me cold. It described my property as a former private landing strip, inactive, 9 words. Those 9 words did more damage than any bulldozer, because every downstream document accepted them as established fact. Once the airstrip was inactive, the setbacks changed, the notification requirements changed, and dozens of lots that could never have been platted beside a working runway suddenly fit neatly on the drawings. But I had never closed Hale Field. I had never filed a notice of deactivation, never signed a relinquishment, never sold it, never leased it, never let it lapse. My insurance was current, my fuel receipts were current, my logbook showed operations in every month of both years in question, and the pavement was in better condition than the county road out front. Grant sat back and said the thing I had been circling without saying. Someone told the county I was out of business, and the county believed them because nobody thought to ask me. He laid out the 2 separate problems, and he was precise about keeping them separate, which I came to appreciate. The first problem was that the association was trying to convert a planning map designation into evidence of ownership, which is roughly like claiming your neighbor's car because you drew it in your driveway. That one, he said, was almost embarrassing in its weakness, and any judge would dispose of it quickly once we forced them to produce an instrument they did not have. The second problem was heavier. Someone had represented to a government body that an active airport had ceased operations, and that representation had induced approvals affecting hundreds of lots and eventually the safety of families who had done nothing wrong. That was not a boundary dispute. That was a false statement with consequences attached. I went to the next open association meeting, which was held in the clubhouse ballroom with maybe 90 residents present and folding chairs in uneven rows. I sat in the back in a clean shirt with a folder in my lap. When the Eastern expansion came up, Vanessa did what I expected and made me the obstacle before I had said a word. She told the room that nearly 1,000 homeowners were being held hostage by an obsolete airstrip serving one man's personal hobby, that the association had bent over backward to accommodate me, and that my refusal to cooperate was costing every family present real money. Heads turned toward me. A few people I had waved to on the road for years would not meet my eyes. I stood up. I did not defend my hobby because framing it as a hobby was the trap. I did not talk about my father or about the way people say obsolete when they mean unwanted. I asked one question, loud enough for the back rows, and I asked it without any edge in my voice at all. Who told the county that Hale Field had ceased operations? Vanessa said that the association's consultants had determined the status. I asked for the name of the consultant. She said the technical details were handled by professionals and moved to the next agenda item. I sat back down, but something had shifted in the room, because 2 rows ahead of me a woman turned to her husband and said, not quietly enough, that it was a fair question. That was when I understood the real shape of Vanessa's weakness. She had an enormous volume of paper, and she wanted every conversation to be about what the paper said. She could not survive a conversation about who had written it. The following morning I came out at 6 and found 4 concrete highway barriers sitting across my taxiway, right at the point where it meets the ramp in front of the hangar. Not on the runway, which would have been unambiguous and stupid, but across the connector, so that no airplane could reach the pavement from the building. It was careful work. It did not damage anything. It did not technically block the runway itself, and it rendered my airport unusable in one morning without a single provable act of destruction. My driveway camera had recorded a flatbed with a contractor logo on the door, arriving at 10:40 the previous night. I did not move them. Every instinct I had said to get the tractor and drag those things into the ditch by sunrise, and I stood there with my coffee going cold and did not do it. Instead, I photographed each barrier with a tape measure laid alongside it. I pulled the video and copied it twice. When Vanessa emailed at 9 to explain that the placement was a protective measure securing association assets pending resolution, I printed the email and added it to the folder because a written admission that you put the obstruction there is worth more than the obstruction is worth to you. I called Grant and told him what had happened and asked whether I should force the issue. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the sentence I have repeated to myself many times since. He told me to stop interrupting them while they were digging and to simply keep measuring the depth. So that is what I did. I filed a report with the sheriff for the record and made no demands, notified the State Aeronautics Office that access to an active field had been physically obstructed, and let every one of those 4 gray barriers sit exactly where the association had placed them. Each day they stayed was a day I did not have to prove intent. They had already proven it in concrete. Meanwhile, Crescent Ridge East went up at a speed that told me somebody was racing a clock. Foundations poured on a Monday had framing by Thursday. The model home at the far end, closest to my eastern threshold, was finished and furnished, with a flag out front and a sandwich board advertising a decorator open house. 9 more were skeletons of yellow pine, and grading had begun on a second cluster even closer to the fence. Trucks ran the new entrance from 6 in the morning until the light quit. I sat on my tailgate one evening and counted 11 rooflines that had not existed at the start of spring. Vanessa's confidence during those weeks was not an act, and I want to be fair about that. She had reason for it. Buyers had put down deposits, some of them substantial, and she believed that once 40 families had money committed to houses next to my fence, the politics would do her work for her. She had built her entire strategy on a simple wager, which was that a county planning board would sooner squeeze one man off a runway than tell 4 dozen homeowners that their closings were in question. It is not a stupid wager. It is how a great many things get decided. She said it to my face at a meeting she requested at a coffee place in town, which I attended only because Grant told me to and to bring a recorder in a state where one-party consent is legal. She leaned in, stirred something, and told me I could hold on to my old piece of paper if it made me feel powerful, but I could not fight an entire neighborhood. I told her I had no plans to fight a neighborhood. I told her all I needed to know was who signed. She smiled like the answer did not matter and left me with the check. While she was pressuring me, Grant was pulling threads backward through time, and he found the one that mattered. When the original Crescent Ridge development was approved more than a decade earlier, the file included an aviation easement recorded against the residential parcels, along with a mapped notice area tied to aircraft operations at Hale Field. In plain English, the first developer had formally acknowledged that airplanes would fly low over those lots, had accepted that condition in writing, and had passed that acknowledgement along to every buyer through the title work. That easement was signed, recorded, and indexed. It was not ambiguous. It was proof, in the county's own vault, that everyone involved had known exactly what my runway was. On the Eastern Expansion submittal, that notice was simply gone. No revocation, no release, no explanation, no reference. The narrative that had described an aviation easement and an operational airfield in the earlier file described, in the new one, an inactive strip and unencumbered acreage. Grant put the 2 pages side by side and tapped them with the pencil and said nothing at all, which from him was a shout. Documents do not lose whole encumbrances by accident. Somebody had rewritten the surrounding conditions to make the arithmetic work. That week I contacted the State Aeronautics Office directly and notified them in writing that Hale Field remained an active private airport, that its access had been physically obstructed, and that residential construction was proceeding within the approach corridor at the eastern end. I attached the current data, photographs of the barriers, dated photographs of the framing, and a copy of my deed. I did not make accusations. I described conditions and let the conditions be alarming on their own. The office confirmed receipt and told me the information would be forwarded to the relevant parties for verification of the airport's status and of the new construction around it. I hung up and did not expect anything to happen quickly. Vanessa had no idea I had done this, and she kept escalating in the meantime, which in hindsight was the greatest gift she gave me. The association mailed me an invoice for $11,400 in what it called common land management costs and unpaid assessments. I am not and have never been a member of that association. My property was never annexed into it, never subjected to its declaration, and appears nowhere in its governing documents. I mailed the invoice back with a certified copy of my deed and a 1-sentence letter, and I kept the return receipt. She sent another one 30 days later with a late fee. I kept that too. By then, my green accordion folder had become 3 ring binders. Then Grant got the original of the document the county had actually relied on, the source of those 9 poisonous words, and he called me at 7 in the morning and told me to come in. It was a supplemental land use statement submitted with the Eastern application, 4 pages, unremarkable typography, and at the bottom of page 4, under a heading about existing conditions, was a declarative sentence. The property owner has ceased aviation use and does not object to adjacent residential development. Beneath it was a signature line. The line held no signature. There was no ink, no mark, nothing handwritten anywhere on the page. But typed neatly beneath the empty line, in the same font as the rest of the document, was a name. Marcus Hale. I looked at it for a long time. I have signed my name on aircraft logbooks for 2 decades, and my signature is a specific and inconvenient thing with a hook on the M that I have never been able to break. It was not on that page. Nothing of mine was on that page. Somebody had typed my name under a statement about my own land and let a government office assume the rest, and it had worked because who checks? I told Grant quietly that I had never seen this piece of paper in my life. Grant capped his pencil, which I had never seen him do mid-meeting. Then he said that if that was true, this had stopped being a dispute between a homeowners association and a landowner. It was now a question about what had been represented to a public body, by whom, and with what knowledge. He said the county would have to answer for what it approved on that basis, and that the moment aviation authorities looked at the same file, the ground under everyone would shift. 3 weeks after Vanessa stood on my runway and told me to step aside, I found out he was right. The vehicles came on a Thursday just after 9 in the morning, 2 of them, government plates, parking neatly on the apron in front of my hangar. The man who got out of the first one introduced himself as Daniel Reeves, an aviation safety specialist, and he had a colleague with him and a case of maps and a manner that was neither friendly nor hostile, just methodical. He was not there to take anyone's side, and he said so early. He was there because 2 record systems described the same 43 acres in ways that could not both be true, and because a notification had come through indicating structures were going up near an operating runway with no evidence anyone had evaluated it. Then we walked to the eastern threshold, and he stopped, and he unfolded a chart and turned it to match the ground. He looked at the map, and then up at the model home with the flag, and then at the 10 framed houses behind it, and then back at the map. He did that 3 times. Anybody who has ever watched a professional realize the size of a problem knows exactly what that looks like. Then he asked me, without any drama at all, who had approved those houses while this runway was operating. I told him that was precisely the question I had been trying to get answered for 4 months, and that nobody would give me a name. A contractor called Vanessa because of course he did, and her white sedan came up the construction road within 20 minutes. She got out already talking, and I have to admit she held her posture well. She informed Mr. Reeves that the Airstrip was association property currently undergoing a use conversion, that the matter was in the hands of council, and that any inquiries should be directed through the management office. She said it the way she said everything, as though the sentence itself settled the question. Daniel Reeves listened politely, and then asked her who the owner of record was. She said that ownership was being updated. I handed him the recorded deed, the current tax statement, and the plat with the parcel line drawn through the middle of the runway. My name was on all 3, in 3 different offices, going back to 1986. He read them, handed them back, and thanked me. Then he turned to Vanessa and asked his second question, which was who had reported the airport as discontinued. She started talking about the consulting firm the association had retained for the Eastern study. He asked for the name of the firm and the name of the individual who prepared the land use statement and the date of the site visit. She said she would have to look. He said he would need the file. She said the technical work was handled by professionals under contract and that she was not personally involved in the preparation of documents. He asked, in the same even tone, who had signed the transmittal. And for the first time since she had walked onto my property in that white sedan, Vanessa Whitmore said she needed to speak with her attorney. I did not gloat. I want to be honest that I felt the pull of it, standing there with my hand on the fender of a 19-year-old truck, while the woman who had called my life's work a thing looked for an exit. But I have learned that when the record is finally speaking for you, the worst thing you can do is talk over it. So I said nothing at all. I just stood there, and I could see that my silence bothered her more than anything I could have said, because she kept glancing at me as though waiting for an insult she could repeat to somebody later, and it never came. Before he left, Reeves made a point of clarifying something to both of us, and he did it deliberately, in front of her. He said federal aviation authorities do not decide local residential zoning and do not have the power to order a county to unbuild a house. What they do have is a process, and structures proposed near an active airport can trigger notification requirements, aeronautical study, and safety coordination that the current record did not appear to reflect at all. If those steps had been skipped because the field was described as inactive, then the county's approvals rested on a foundation that would have to be examined. That was not a threat. It was just a description of what happens when a fact is wrong in a place where facts have consequences. The matter went back to the county within days, and that is when Nora Kincaid, the planning director, entered the story. She was a careful woman with an unglamorous job and, I came to believe, a genuine dislike of being lied to. She ordered a full review of the Crescent Ridge East file, from the original submittal through every approval issued. Pending permits in the eastern cluster were held while the review ran. Framing crews arrived one Monday to find nothing to work on and left by noon. From my hangar door, I could hear how quiet it was over there, and the quiet was louder than the hammers had ever been. Vanessa's control started coming apart in that quiet. She sent an association-wide notice blaming unspecified regulatory interference for the delay. 2 days later, she sent a second one blaming me by name. That was a mistake, because it put my name in 990 mailboxes attached to a story that residents could check for themselves, and some of them started checking. Nora Kincaid convened a meeting 3 weeks later in the county building, in a room with a long table and bad fluorescent light. I was there with Grant. Vanessa was there with the association's attorney, a tired-looking man who kept touching his collar. The development partner sent 2 representatives. 2 planners attended, along with a person from the state aeronautics office and Daniel Reeves on a call line. Nora ran it like an inventory rather than an argument, which was exactly the right instinct, because there was no argument to have once the papers were in order. She started at the beginning and put each document on the table in chronological order. The original survey from before the first house existed, showing Hale Field. The recorded deed, showing me. The tax rolls, showing me paying on the runway parcel every year without interruption. The recorded aviation easement from the first phase of Crescent Ridge, in which the original developer formally acknowledged aircraft operations at my field and accepted the burden on the residential lots. The title work delivered to early buyers, which disclosed the same thing. 11 years of documents that all agreed with each other. Then she set down the eastern submittal. In it, Hale Field appeared as a former airstrip. The notice area was gone, and there was the supplemental statement, page 4, saying that the property owner had ceased aviation use and did not object to adjacent residential development, with my name typed beneath a blank line. Nora asked me directly whether I had made that statement. I said no. I said I had never seen the document before my attorney obtained it from the county file, that I had never ceased aviation use, and that I had flown from Hale Field in every month covered by the application period. Grant produced my logbook, my insurance policy, my fuel invoices, and 3 exemplars of my actual signature from unrelated recorded instruments. The difference did not require an expert. The typed name was not a signature at all, and no one in the room pretended otherwise. Vanessa's attorney made the argument he had to make, which was that the association had relied in good faith on information furnished by a retained consultant and that any error originated with that firm. It was not a bad position. It might even have held if the file had ended there. But Nora had one more folder, and it held internal correspondence. 8 months before the final approvals, a planner in her own office had written to the association raising a concern in plain language, stating that ownership and airport status must be independently verified before final approval given the discrepancy in the record. It was addressed to the association's president. Nora turned the page and read the reply out loud. The reply said the owner has already agreed to discontinue operations, and it was sent from Vanessa Whitmore's account, under her signature block, on a Tuesday afternoon in September. I had never agreed to anything. In September of that year, I had been out on the runway in 90-degree heat repainting the numbers with a template and a roller. Nobody had asked me a single question about discontinuing my operations, because if anyone had, the answer would have taken 4 seconds and ended the entire eastern expansion right there. The room was completely silent. The association's attorney stopped touching his collar. One of the development representatives put down his pen and looked at Vanessa with an expression I would describe as the exact moment a partnership ends, and I understood, sitting there, that this was the shape of the whole thing. She may never have forged anything with her own hand. She had done something more ordinary and, in the end, more damaging. She had told a public office, repeatedly and in writing, that I had agreed to something I was never asked about, and everyone downstream had built on top of her assurance because presidents of associations are assumed to know their own boundaries. I said one thing during that entire meeting that was not a factual answer to a question. I looked across the table at her and told her she had never needed my signature because she had discovered she could simply tell everyone I had given one. She did not take that well. She turned to Nora and started talking about the hundreds of families whose home values were now in question, about buyers with deposits at risk, about how one man with a private airstrip and a grudge was destroying a community for the sake of a toy. She was fluent. She had clearly performed this speech in her head. It was the same instinct that had made her point at me in the clubhouse, scaled up for a room with more authority in it. I had absorbed a lot of that over the previous months without answering, and I answered then. I told her that she had built houses beside my runway, declared my land to be hers, put concrete across my taxiway, billed me for the privilege, and told a county office I had consented to all of it, and that she was now sitting in a government building explaining that I was the problem. I did not raise my voice. I have found that you do not have to, when the sequence itself is the argument. Nora closed the meeting with findings rather than judgments. Her preliminary review indicated that several Eastern lot approvals had been issued on the basis of incomplete or incorrect information regarding the operational status of the airfield and the existence of recorded aviation encumbrances. Uncompleted permits were suspended pending correction. Completed structures would not be demolished, which surprised nobody and which I did not want anyway. Instead, the county would have to work through remedial planning amendments, safety evaluations of the eastern cluster, revised setbacks, and a determination of financial responsibility for the review costs and for any buyers whose contracts were now impaired. It was messier than a clean victory and more real. Nobody's house came down. But every homeowner in Crescent Ridge learned that their association had spent their money advancing a project built on assertions that were never true, and that the president they had elected had personally written the sentence that made it possible. That knowledge did more to Vanessa Whitmore than any ruling could have. She called an emergency association meeting 9 days later, and she came in swinging. The clubhouse was full this time. Standing room along the back wall, folding chairs all the way to the doors. Her presentation was built on 3 claims, delivered with slides. That I was a selfish man who refused to adapt to a changing community. That my obstruction had frozen a development the entire neighborhood depended on. That property values across all 993 homes were now threatened by my refusal to be reasonable. She never once mentioned the September email. I came with Grant and a cardboard box. I did not give a speech, because a speech would have let her respond to my tone instead of my dates. I asked for 5 minutes and I laid out the timeline, one document at a time, held up so people could see it. In the first year, the developer of Crescent Ridge recorded an easement formally acknowledging that Hale Field existed and that aircraft would operate over these homes. In the second year, this association offered to buy that runway from me for a fraction of its value, and I declined. And I passed around the written offer with Vanessa's name on it. After that, and only after that, planning documents began describing my airport as inactive. Then the association's president informed the county in writing that I had agreed to shut it down. Then the association posted signs declaring my land to be community property and placed concrete across my taxiway. I set the last page down and said nothing else. The room did the rest. A man near the front, a retired postal supervisor named Ray Delgado, who I had waved at on the road for 6 years, stood up and asked Vanessa the only question that mattered, and he asked it kindly, which somehow made it worse. If the association truly owns that runway, why did you offer to buy it from him 2 years ago? She said the offer had been a courtesy structured to avoid litigation. Somebody laughed, one short ugly sound from the back. Then a board member named Priscilla Vaughn, who had been on the board the entire time and had voted for every Eastern resolution, stood up and said something that ended it. She said that in 2 years, the board had never once been shown a deed, a title report, or any recorded instrument establishing association ownership of the airstrip, and that every time she asked, she had been told it was with counsel. After that, the meeting was not a meeting. People stood up out of order. Somebody demanded to know how much had been spent on the Eastern legal work. Somebody else asked whether their closing was in danger. A woman near the middle asked loudly whether any of them could be personally liable, and the association's attorney gave an answer so hedged that it terrified the room more than a yes would have. I did not enjoy that part as much as I expected to. These were people whose worst crime was believing a confident woman with a slide deck, and some of them had bought houses in good faith that were now inside a mess they had no hand in making. When it quieted enough for me to be heard, I said the only thing I had come there to say. I told them I had never wanted anyone's home to lose $1 of value. I told them I only wanted people to stop selling something they did not own. The board voted that night to retain independent counsel to review every decision made regarding Crescent Ridge East, with specific attention to representations made to the county. Vanessa was stripped of authority over the Eastern matter pending that review. She sat through the vote with her hands flat on the table and her chin up, and I will give her this much: she did not cry and she did not run. 4 days later, a contractor's truck came down the association road, and 2 men in vests pulled the aluminum signs off the posts at my gate line. I watched from the hangar door with a cup of coffee. I had not touched those signs in 5 months, had not laid a finger on them, and now the same organization that installed them was paying men by the hour to take them away. They dug out the concrete footings too, badly, leaving 2 raw holes in my grass that I filled in myself that weekend. I did not mind, some holes you are happy to fill. Vanessa drove up while they were loading the second sign. She did not get out of the car. She sat there with the engine running and the window up, and I stood by the hangar with the coffee going cold in my hand, and we looked at each other through the windshield for what must have been 15 seconds. There was no speech. There was no last cutting remark about civilized neighborhoods or men who should know when to step aside. She had built her entire relationship with me out of things she said. and she had finally reached the end of the things that worked. Then she backed down the drive and left, and that was the last time she was ever on my property. The ending was not the one I had imagined during the angriest weeks, and I have made peace with that, because the one I imagined was not honest. 993 houses did not come down. Nobody was frog-marched anywhere. What happened instead was slower and more permanent. The Eastern Plan was reopened and substantially rewritten, with the lots nearest my threshold removed entirely and others reoriented. New setbacks were established along the runway corridor, along with a recorded notice restoring what the original easement had said all along. The county's records were corrected to reflect that Hale Field is active, privately owned, and operating, and the aviation data was verified and updated to match. The association formally withdrew its ownership claim in a 2-paragraph letter that took 11 months and, I am told, 4 separate attorneys to produce. The independent review concluded that the president had made material representations to the county that were unsupported by any documentation and had not been authorized by any board vote. The association absorbed the bulk of the review costs, the remedial planning fees, and the settlements with 2 buyers whose contracts collapsed. And the dues assessment that followed made a great many people very unhappy with a woman who no longer had a title. Vanessa Whitmore resigned before the recall vote could be held. I heard later that she moved. I did not become rich out of any of it. There was a settlement, and it covered grants fees and the barrier removal and the resurfacing of the taxiway section that had been damaged by the concrete, and there was some left over that I put toward a new hangar door. That is the whole of my windfall. What I won was not money. What I won was that at the end of all of it, I still owned the thing that had always been mine, and now the paperwork in 3 different offices agreed with the ground under my feet. On a cool morning a few months after the last letter, I pulled the airplane out of the hangar by myself, the way I have 1,000 times. The windsock lifted and drifted and settled again in a light breeze out of the northwest. The taxiway was clear all the way to the ramp. I did my walk-around slowly, because I always do, and I looked east through the pines at the roof lines that are still there and will be there long after I am not. I thought about what Vanessa told me in that coffee place, when she leaned in and said I could not fight an entire neighborhood. She was right about one thing, and I have said so out loud since. I could not have fought 993 houses, and I never tried. I only had to hold on to my deed, keep my records, refuse every invitation to do something stupid, and wait for the right person to ask the right question. It took 11 months and a stack of paper I can barely lift. It did not take a single raised voice. I ran the engine up, released the brakes, and rolled. The pavement my father poured went by under the wheels the way it has since 1986, and at 70 knots I eased the nose up and the ground let go of me. Coming around in the crosswind turn, I looked down at the gate, where a new sign stands on 2 posts I set myself. In concrete I mixed myself, on ground the county now agrees is mine. It says Hale Field, private property, established 1986. And beside it, there is not a single association logo left anywhere.